Recently, we got more Thieves Rostermania news. To start off, there's some more rumors going around about Envoy possibly being replaced. I know in the last video, we talked about Ghosty and that he was the only one that had been looked at being replaced. And I think a lot of people were shocked because they expected Envoy to be the first one to go based on his more recent performances. But the news broke that Ghosty was the guy that the Thieves were looking to replace. Now it's coming out that the Thieves may also be looking to replace Envoy with Joe Deceives, Abizi, or Neptune. Any of those three players seem to be on the Thieves' radar. Now, for me personally, I think out of those three players, your number one option is Joe Deceives. At least if we're going based on the rumored constructed roster, which as of right now, I believe will be Selenium, Scrap, and Hydra. I think if the Thieves move on from Ghosty and they get Celium, I think the best line of decision making here is going to be to pick up Joe Deceives if they're not planning on keeping Envoy. The reason I say this is because I feel like out of the three options given, Joe Deceives is probably the best objective player out of them. And he also brings a lot of slaying power as well. So I think having him on the team will help kind of round out that OBJ presence that I feel like will be missing if they end up moving on from Envoy. I also think Joe Deceives will actually bring a decent amount of communication because from what we've seen with Ultra, it seemed like he was a pretty solid communicator when we would jump into the listen ins. And on top of that, I also know he got a lot better with that when he was on the Thieves when it came to just talking to him personally, as well as talking to some of the coaching staff when he was there. So Joe Deceives for me is probably the number one option. I think Abizi is a close number two, naturally because he's one of the best subs of all time. Like you don't want to miss out on an opportunity like in Abizi to pair along with Hydra. My biggest concern with the Abizi move or a potential Abizi move is that his play style is probably a little more similar to Hydra in the sense that the OBJ is not necessarily his priority. We've seen with the phase team that Simp is kind of the objective guy, even though he still does bring that high level slaying power. I don't know if Abizi will have as easy of a transition becoming more of that role because I just don't see the Thieves telling Hydra that he needs to play the objective more. I think if anything, it's going to come down to Abizi swapping to that. Now, I'm not saying I think he can't. I definitely think he can. It's more of just how well he'll be able to do it or how fast he'll be able to do it. I think having two subs that play a similar role is going to be a little challenging at first, but if they do end up going with him, I think they could figure it out because there's just going to be so much talent on the team. On top of that, I think the chemistry between Celium and Abizi should still be there, as well as the chemistry between Scrap and Hydra. So basically, taking two different duos and pairing them together should ideally mesh the chemistry a lot faster. At least that's what I'm hoping. Now, given the fact that it's a sub and an AR duo on each side of things, that maybe that'll be a little tougher because Scrap is going to have to get used to playing with Celium and Hydra would have to get used to playing with Abizi. I think it's more than doable, but like I said, I feel like Joe brings more of the OBJ presence off the rip that I personally like. And naturally, having Joe come back as a Thieves fan would be really cool because I loved getting to watch him develop last season, and it would be really cool to have him back on the Thieves. Now, as I mentioned, the last player that the Thieves were looking at when it comes to a possible envoy swap is Neptune. And in my mind, I think he is the worst option out of the three, but I don't mean that as he's a bad option. I just think what he brings is not necessarily what the Thieves need. And I think if you're talking the caliber of players, right? Like Abizi is just naturally, I feel like a higher caliber player of Neptune. And I think consistently he's shown that. So having Abizi over him, that's why I say that because Neptune is a great player and he showed this year that he's a really good player. but Abizi has shown it more consistently. And yes, maybe he didn't have his best of years this season, but we know what Abizi can do, and it feels like less of a risk. I feel like picking up Neptune is a little more of a risk because he plays a fast paced, kill heavy play style. And we don't really need that alongside of Hydra, especially if we do end up picking up Celium as well. At that point, we kind of just become a really kill heavy team, and I don't know who's going to swap to what. I feel like if we were to bring on Neptune, he would end up kind of dropping in numbers because he has to play around Hydra, Scrap, and Celium. And I just don't see that as working very well. Whereas, as I mentioned before, a Joe Deceives is kind of already doing that role and he does it pretty well. So naturally, there's going to be less kills on the map when you have Scrap and Hydra. But then if you bring on Celium, that's really going to drop off a lot, but Joe is so much more than capable of picking up kills while he's on the OBJ, and that's kind of the point. Like, if you have somebody like him, you know that at least coming, he's the back line, right? Like when everybody's coming to the hard point or the control zone or whatever the OBJ is, he's going to be the guy that can lock it down, and everybody else can kind of go out and slay around him. And I do think that the trio that is rumored, like I said, including Celium, would do a really good job of that. Now, naturally, I think out of all three of those players, they can all do that same type of role. But when you start looking at maybe like S&D as well, Abizi is one of, if not the best at getting first bloods in S&D. That is not the guy you want taking the bomb, right? Like if he is so good at getting those first bloods, you do not want him to have to slow down his play style when that is what he is so good at. You don't want to change that. Whereas with Joe, he already runs that role. So those are some of the options that the Thieves have when it comes to replacing Envoy. Now, I think if the Thieves end up fully moving on from Ghosty, that keeping Envoy is not necessarily the worst decision in the world because we still have an OBJ player at the end of the day. But I also understand wanting to change both players because both of them kind of struggled at the end of the season. Now, my preference personally is I would like to ideally try and get Joe and keep Ghosty because I think Ghosty and Joe as a duo was really good. And I think they both have a lot of talent. And Ghosty brings more of the communication that I feel like the Thieves need. But with more recent news, it has come out that it is official. Ghosty is a restricted free agent. So it seems like it's leaning a lot more towards they're moving on from him. Now, nothing is set in stone yet. Obviously, there's still room for negotiations or something to fall out, but because he has now officially become a restricted free agent, it seems like they're trending in the direction of moving on from him. Otherwise, I feel like they wouldn't have let him explore his options and they would have kind of just anchored him down and kept him there. So, from what I've heard or from what I've seen, it does seem like Celium is the most probable to be picked up from the Thieves. But as we talked about before, we don't know for sure. There could be a bidding match between the Thieves and the Falcons because I know it's been talked about that the Falcons have put up an offer for him as well. So, like I said, nothing's set in stone, but just the way it seems as of right now, it seems like Celium is probably the guy that the Thieves are going after and are probably going to end up getting. Now, don't forget, Abuza is still somebody that the Thieves have talked about, or not the Thieves specifically, but the rumors have come out that the Thieves are looking towards. It also came out that Draza did deny the Thieves' offer, if I'm not mistaken, which I'm not really surprised there. As we talked about before, I didn't see it working between him and Scrap. There's too much personal beef there. So I'm not too surprised by that. But I do think he would have been the best option when it comes to replacing Ghosty at the AR position. So as of right now, if I had to predict who I think the Thieves starting four is going to be, I have a feeling it's going to be Celium, Scrap, Hydra, and Abizi. That's who I think it will be. But I would love to have Joe in that secondary sub spot because I just feel like him and Hydra as a duo will be really good. And as I mentioned, the OBJ presence that Joe Deceives brings is awesome. He's a really young player with so much upside, knowing that this past season was basically his first full year in the CDL and he looked phenomenal. So it would be really interesting to see him back under Shane as his coach, as well as playing with Paco alongside of him. I feel like that sub duo would be incredible to watch. And that's just what I look forward to the most. But that's all the recent news that we have. Obviously, as I've said before, if we get any more information, I will be making another video and talking about that. But for now, that's all we have. It does seem like the dominoes are going to start falling sometime soon, knowing that Ghosty is now officially a restricted free agent. And I feel like Thieves and FaZe are the two teams that everybody is kind of looking out for because they're going to impact the trajectory of every other team and how they decide to form. So we should be getting more information soon. I'm hoping it doesn't take too long for more stuff to come out, but be on the lookout for those videos. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so that way you get notified every time a new video comes out. Uh, Outside of that, just hit that like button if you enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Peace out, everybody.